All right, lovely lovelies. You will hopefully be getting this recording soon. This is the second time I've had to record it because somehow I didn't have the mic on the first time. So here we go again. So today we are going to be talking about plants a little bit more, obviously, but we're going to get into kind of the different types of cells plants have, how those make how those make tissues and how those make organs, and the rest of the plant. The statistical facts for today is the odds of bowling a perfect 300 game is 1 in 11,500. So I don't know if you guys are bowlers, but there you go. All right, so our grumps and good things. I want to hear what's going on with you guys, so I'll leave some room in the Edpuzzle for that. And then for our warm-up, it says for us to give an example of a plant that you eat that's a monocot and a plant that you eat that's a dicot. So if you'll recall in our last video, we talked about the differences between monocots and dicots as angiosperms. They have a set of characteristics that are different. So some examples. So a monocot that I eat is rice and also corn. There are some others that I could think of. Onions are an example as well, but that covers it. And then dicots, there's a little bit more variety there. Tomatoes, anything that's beans or peas go into that category. So the idea is that you kind of think about the characteristics. Like if you look at an onion plant, you can see it kind of in a green onion that they have those parallel veins. And then also, like with rice and corn, if you look at the kernel, it is just one piece. It can't be split into two. So that's kind of a clue there. And then the same with rice. And then tomatoes and beans and stuff like that, you can split those into two. So those are just some examples of those different plants. Okay. So, as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about the different levels of organization in plants. And plants play a big part in our lives, whether we think about them a whole lot or not. So, you have seen these levels of organization before, how things that are multicellular go from cells, different types of cells make tissues, tissues make organs, organs make organ systems, and organ systems make organisms. This is true for all organisms that are multicellular. So that includes, if we're thinking about our kingdoms, so that's animals, plants, and fungi. And so usually we don't think about this too much in anything except for animals. So we're going to look at it in terms of plants today. So we're going to start with this cells level. And what I have listed here, the reason that we're focusing on these three types of cells is they are the most abundant, meaning if you were to count the cells in the plant, these would be the most numerous. But there are lots of other types. So the other types, though, are a little bit, probably a little bit more familiar to you. And these ones tend to be the most important because you see them in all the parts of the plant, all the organs of the plant, which are leaves, stems, and roots. You'll see these cell types, whereas the other cell types are specific to the different organs that they make up. So we'll talk about these here, but you'll see as we get into tissues and organs, there are a few other cell types. All right, so the first type we're going to talk about are called parenchyma cells. These are the most common of the three. They're found throughout the plant. They are for storage, so they store water. They also store carbohydrates and oils, so all the kinds of things that can be stored within the plant. So when you look at them under a microscope, which is what this picture is, this is a microscopic image of parenchyma cells, there are some characteristics you can look for to kind of identify them, like, oh yes, this is a parenchyma cell. So one thing is that they have these thin cell walls that are pretty consistent, meaning they're the same thickness, although they're relatively thin. And then the other thing is they have these gaps in between the cells. Those are just kind of identifiers. If you see those characteristics, then you're looking at parenchyma cells. The other thing that, as far as their function, is because when you think about healing of a plant wound, think about it the same way you would think of healing a wound in an animal, is there's going to be stuff that goes to that place and starts to repair. And so that's going to happen with the parenchyma cells in plants. So that's what they look like, that's what they do, and we'll see them again when we talk about tissues. All right, so the next ones we're going to talk about are collenchyma cells, and these are going to be providing support to all types of plants, whether they're herbaceous or woody. They're going to have collenchyma cells that are going to provide support to hold the plant upright, or just to help it to maintain its three-dimensional structure, almost like a little bit, maybe think about it like a skeletal system, so providing that support to just have the plant body maintain its shape. So it's flexible, but still strong. So looking under a microscope, which is what you see here, the way you can tell these is they have these thick cell walls, and the cell walls are kind of uneven. So we've got really thick sections like right here, and then some thinner sections, but still thicker than what we saw with the parenchyma cells. And you can see as we extend in this direction that we start to see a difference. These start to thin out, and we start to see some gaps. So this is showing both. We've got just a little bit of the edge of parenchyma down here, but true collenchyma cells are going to be like this kind of thicker cell wall business. Okay. And then the third type are called sclerenchyma cells. And sclerenchyma cells are almost exclusively found in woody plants. And that's because what happens is they really start to have their functionality in the plant whenever they die. So the only thing I can kind of think of that's similar to this in animals is like a callus. So when you build up a callus, it's like you have those dead skin cells in that location, and they are protective and kind of make it a strong point. Those of you that are runners, you might know, like at first you get blisters, and then you kind of build up those calluses, and that's actually, a strength on your foot, or a place where your foot is more durable. So it's kind of the same idea. So these sclerenchyma cells are going to be the ones that have lignin, which, remember, lignin is that carbohydrate that can be found in some plant cell walls along with cellulose. And those are going to give that woody strength to those kind of plants. And so that's why, usually when you look at them under the microscope, they're not going to be green because they're no longer undergoing photosynthesis, because they're dead cells, but they're going to build up in the plant and give it that strength. This is another picture of some sclerenchyma cells that are in still a woody plant, but one that doesn't get quite as much bark as others. But you can still see this kind of accumulation here, where that lignin is building up within the plant. So those are the three most abundant cell types. Please excuse my dogs if you hear them fighting. They have no manners. This is my life. Okay. Diana, can you close the door, please? Okay. So remember, we were talking about these levels of organization. So we've talked about cells. So one of the things I want you to notice is when we looked at these cell types, these don't necessarily look like this picture of a plant cell that we have in our mind. Those structures are there. It's just that it doesn't look just like this. So you have to be careful with that when you look at, when you think about what cells look like. They do have these structures, but this drawing exists to give you a very detailed picture. That's not what we see when we look under a microscope every time. So don't let that fool you into. I don't want you to think that these cells don't have those things. They do. It's just that we can't necessarily see all those things all the time. Okay, so in our levels of organization, we go from cells to tissues. And so there are those three cell types can be found in all of our organs, and we're going to see them around these tissues or making up these tissues, depending on what tissue it is. So let's talk about the different tissues that we find in plants. So the first one we're going to talk about is called ground tissue. And the reason I put it first is because all three of the cell types that we talked about are found in ground tissue if we're talking about a woody plant. And so it's found throughout the plant. It's going to provide support. That support's going to come from the collenchyma cells or the sclerenchyma cells, depending on what type of plant it is. And these are going to this tissue acts as a place for storage, and that's where those parenchyma cells come in. So we find these ground tissue throughout the plant, in the certain parts of the leaf, in the stem, and certain parts of the root. We will find that ground tissue. Okay, so one of the ways to kind of remember that is when we think of being grounded, we're kind of connected, and so this ground tissue connects all through the plant. So hopefully that helps you remember ground tissue. Okay, so the next type is dermal tissue. So you may have heard of the term epidermis. So there was this joke that we used to say when I was a kid because we were super cool. We would say your epidermis is showing, and it was to make people like think that something, was exposed that wasn't supposed to be. But epidermis just means your skin. And so that word part, derm, refers to skin, just like the dermatologist is the doctor that you go to for a skin issue. So dermal tissue on the plant is the tissue around the outside. And it functions much like our dermal tissue does. It provides protection. It secretes things like our skin tissue secretes oils and things like that. The dermal tissue of the plant secretes the cuticle, which is that waxy thing. Remember we talked about in the last lesson that if this were gone, then the plant would dry out because it wouldn't have that to help hold in that water. This is what forms eventually the bark of our woody plants, or especially trees. And it also has these trichomes, which are kind of like these hair-like projections that we see on lots of plants. And those can have oils and stuff on them as well. Okay, and then we have what's called vascular tissue. And again, this has a parallel in animals. So we have, some animals have vascular tissue, not all of them, but certainly humans have vascular tissue. And so it functions in our bodies to transport things throughout, like our blood is transported throughout our body in our vascular system. The vascular tissue in the plant is also used for transport. But the plant doesn't have blood, but it's going to transport water, minerals, which are going to be dissolved in water, and organic compounds. Remember this term organic way back when we talked about macromolecules or biomolecules. So this is going to be things like proteins and lipids and very importantly carbohydrates. So that's what's going to be transported in this vascular tissue. And there are two main types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. And it's basically a hollow network of tubes. The xylem is the part that's responsible for the water and the stuff that's dissolved in the water and that comes from the soil. And then the phloem is responsible for the photosynthesis products, or what we might call food. And so both of those are found in the plant, and we're going to get into a little bit more depth on these because they have such a strong correlation to what we have. They're kind of It's a good opportunity for us to go into a little bit more depth. So let's talk about xylem. So xylem, again, is going to be used to transport water. Now, when we look at the xylem, if we were to look at a cross-section of it, so if we were to take the plant, this is an x-ray, a microscopic picture, and to slice it and look at it along the sides, what we would see are these cells. And you can see just as adjacent to that are parenchyma cells. So this is where the water is going to be stored, is in some of those parenchyma cells. But we have some different cells as well. So we have what are called vessel element cells and these trachid cells. And so the trachid cells are these long and narrow ones, and those are going to be what allows the water to move through. And then the vessel elements are short and wide, and those are going to kind of add this sieve element as the water is moving through the plant. Okay, and so we have those specialized cells as the water is moving through. So the way that this works, you got to think the water has to move from the roots. Okay, the roots are where the water is going to be absorbed, and it's got to move up through the plant. Well, that has to work against gravity. So what allows that to happen? Because like in our vascular system, we've got muscles. Our heart can push our blood throughout our body, but plants don't have that. So how do they get this liquid to move against gravity up through the plant? And in some cases, vary in these really tall trees and stuff. How does that happen? And it has to do with actually the physical components of water and the structure of the plant. And so we're going to get this stuff here. It's just a teensy bit into some chemistry, which is going to come next year. And I hope you guys will come around and I can help you guys with chemistry as well. And so we're going to kind of just touch on it just a little bit here, but in order for us to understand how xylem works. So the first property of water that we're going to talk about is its cohesive property. So cohesion is the attractiveness or the attraction of one water molecule to another. So here's a water molecule and here's another one, and they are attracted toward each other. And that's called its cohesive property. This is what causes what's called surface tension. So if you've ever seen those insects that like skitter across the water, or if you can like set a paperclip on the water and it doesn't sink, what's supporting those things is that tension between these molecules of water that are attracted toward each other. It's really interesting, in my opinion. So that's the first thing. That's called an intermolecular force. The second property is that water has an adhesive force. So an adhesive, so something that helps me remember this is like an adhesive bandage or a Band-Aid. It sticks to your skin. So an adhesion is water's attraction to other surfaces. So that's what we see here. And so this is what allows water to kind of stick to some surfaces even when gravity is pulling against it. So you may have seen this before when once upon a time you might have learned about how to take measurements using like a graduated cylinder, and your instructor should have told you a little bit about where you take that measurement in terms of this thing here called the meniscus. And what happens is the parts of the water that are touching the side, and this water is especially adhesive to glassware. And so what's happening is that those water molecules that are touching the glass are pulled toward it. And those in the middle that aren't next to the glass aren't pulled toward it. And so you get this kind of U shape. And so with a more narrow tube, you have more surface of the water that's touching the edge versus how much is in the middle. And so it will actually pull, the water will climb because of that attractive force. Okay? It's a really, really cool property that's called capillary action. So those are the properties of water that are going to assist in this. And so you can actually see that. So this is that cross section of the xylem. And so we see these water molecules kind of forming a chain where they're attracted to other water molecules as well as to the side of the tissue of the vascular tissue. And so it helps to create this tension, and that helps to move the water upward. But even more than that, these properties are required, but the other thing that really helps is this process called transpiration. So you may have seen this term transpiration when you learned about the water cycle. And so it is one of the ways that water can get into the atmosphere as vapor. And so what happens is the process of transpiration is how water moves from the roots and out the top of, or out of the plant leaves. And that's going to happen through the stoma. Remember, which those are those openings in the, on the underside of the leaves. And so as that water vapor escapes, the big thing here is that it creates a vacuum. And that pulls the water upward. So that, in addition to the properties of water, like cohesion and adhesion, allow this process to happen relatively easily, and water can move through the plant. It really is a little bit, in my humble opinion, amazing. But that's how it works. And the easiest comparison I have for you is a straw. So a straw, you create that vacuum by sucking on the straw and it pulls the liquid up. And that's what transpiration does, is it creates that vacuum, so it pulls the liquid up the plant, and that's how the water moves. And so that's going to occur through the xylem. All right, so the other type of vascular tissue is called phloem. And phloem is going to be transporting those photosynthesis products, which are going to be starches, specifically sugars. So if we were to take a cross section, if we were to cut into the vascular tissue, we would see that, so these are the cells that make up the phloem, okay? These are the main parts, and then these are what are called companion cells over here. And so what we get are, again, we've got some parenchyma cells adjacent here for storage, so right next door. But we have some cells that are over here undergoing photosynthesis, so we're getting our sugars produced. And so these transfer cells are actually going to, you can it shows them over here. So these transfer cells are going to hold on to some of that sugar, so that if there's injury in the plant, it can send that sugar there to kind of stop the loss. It's almost like a blood clot. So that's what you see with like sap on trees, is it's going there to repair that injury. And then these sieve tube cells are the ones that are going to be responsible for moving the phloem throughout the plant. Okay, so that's the channel that the glucose is going to be able to move through. Now, obviously, this requires some liquid, right? It's got to be able to have that liquid component to move. And so the way that the liquid gets in there is through osmosis. So the xylem is next to these sieve tube cells, and through osmosis, the water can move. So if you'll remember in our transport unit, we talked about how water moves through osmosis from an area of high concentration of water to an area of low concentration of water. And so here, that's what's happening. Okay, in the xylem, we don't have any sugars in there, so it's just the water moving in, and maybe some dissolved minerals, but certainly not as much stuff as we would have in the phloem. And so the water's simply going to transfer across the cell membrane from the xylem into the phloem. And then the phloem will transport that sugar from the source cells, which are going to be in the leaves, out to the plant. And if it's going to be stored, it's going to go into what are called sink cells. And there's basically two types of sinks in plants. So if it's a flowering plant, it could have a sink that's a fruit. Okay, so remember, a fruit, something that has seeds. We'll get more, talk a whole lot about fruits in our next video. So that's one of the places it could go out to a fruit. But all plants have roots, and a lot of plants, even if they are a flowering plant, will still store their carbohydrates in the roots of the plants. And so we call those sinks. This is a term that we use in science for a place that seems to accumulate something that it doesn't immediately use or need. The idea of a sink. All right, so vascular tissue, lots of information there. Since we spent more time on that tissue type, if I were you, I would assume that you would have to know more about that tissue type. All right, so we've covered cells, we've covered tissues. Now we're going to talk about organs. So all